According to Jesus' mythicists, the Babylonian god Mithras was dead for 3 days and then resurrected, and some, like Fraser, even try to make the claim that Mithras' death and resurrection happened on the same day of the year as Jesus. The problem with this theory is there is absolutely no evidence that Mithras ever died. There's a rumor going around on the internet that Jesus' resurrection was just made up by pagan deities that predate Jesus. Let's talk about that. So what I want to share with you guys today is actually a paper that I once wrote for my seminary degree on the supposed pagan parallels that exist before Jesus of a resurrection story that supposedly Jesus is actually invented from. So this is going to be a little bit different than usual. I'm just going to read this paper because I put a lot of work into this, and I think it gives pretty well why this whole idea that Jesus is just made up from pagan deities before Jesus is just bunk. So here we go. One of the more popular theories to explain the resurrection of Jesus Christ is the Christ myth view. It argues that Jesus never existed, not simply because he was not divine, but that there is no actual historical person called Jesus. One of the ways Jesus mythicists try to argue their case is saying Jesus' resurrection was based off pagan myths. Popularized today by a documentary called Zeitgeist from Peter Joseph, the origin of the theory is nothing new. Dating back to at least 1890 from a book by James Fraser called The Golden Bough, a study of comparative religion, or Gerald Massey's work called Natural Genesis. Zeitgeist give a long list of parallels between Jesus and other pagan myth or mythicist deities. For the sake of this video, we will only talk about the claimed resurrection parallels. The myths that Zeitgeist claimed have resurrected stories are Horus, Attis, Krishna, Dionysus, and Mithra. The claim with Zeitgeist and other mythicist theories is that the stories about Jesus were based not on history, but on an attempt to mimic these pagan stories to gain popular acceptance. There are several problems with this theory. First, it makes the grand assumption that because two stories sound similar, that they both must be false. There is no reason, with logical argument, that this can hold water. It is possible that there exists a person from history that sounds very much like myths and stories we know to be false, but that person still actually existed. If Jesus sounds a lot like myths that we know of, it does not in turn mean that Jesus never existed. In order to prove that Jesus' story is made up, one must examine the actual historical evidence for him. But many Jesus mythicists just present the parallels as if they have closed the case already. They propose that if Jesus is similar enough to these ancient myths, then he also must be a myth. The logic simply doesn't work. I could not say that lumberjacks with flannel and axe and a large dog do not exist because they parallel the myth of Paul Bunyan. In the same way, Jesus could still be a real character of history, even though he sounds like folk mythology, the mythology which we know is not true. To give a better example, we could make a very strong case for President Abraham Lincoln and John F. Kennedy never existing. Notice some of the odd similarities between the two presidents. Lincoln became congressman in 1846, Kennedy in 1946. Lincoln became president in 1860, Kennedy in 1960. Both served presidencies concerned with civil rights. Both had a son die while serving the presidency. Both were shot in the head. The assassins of both presidents were killed before they were brought to trial. Lincoln's assassin was born in 1839, Kennedy's in 1939. Both were succeeded by a Johnson, who were born in 1908 and 1808, respectively. Lincoln's assassin shot him from a theater and was caught in a warehouse, while Kennedy's assassin shot him from a warehouse and was caught in a theater. If we say that two stories sharing many similarities must be false, then I have presented a case for Lincoln or Kennedy never existing. But of course, that's absurd. And so the whole Christ myth argument falls apart before we can even examine the data. Stories being similar in no way means that one or both stories must be false. All of that to say, Even if it turned out that Jesus shared some strangely or even eerily similar characteristics or events with one of these myths, it does not prove that Jesus never existed, or that his story is in any way false. Another problem with the Jesus myth theory is that it does not account for the known character of the Jewish people at the time, understanding that really Christianity is seen early on as a form of Judaism. It branches from it. Judaism has existed for over 1,000 years alongside the myths of Egypt, Canaan, Persia, Babylon, Greece, Rome, and others, and never once had given into their polytheism or any other pagan doctrine. Judaism had proven itself to be quite resistant to assimilate or merge its culture with those around it, especially in regards to religious doctrine. Peter Kreeft points out when speaking of the Jews from that time, they were already more demythologized than any other people. The Orthodox Jews were admittedly, even intolerantly opposed to polytheistic myths of paganism and to any attempts to reconcile their religion with others. Nor would anyone be less likely to confuse myth and fact than a Jew. So, if Judaism had sustained itself so long without converging with religions around it, what had made this new shift after the time of Christ? Why assimilate now? What had changed? The Jesus mythicists must provide an answer to these questions, and frankly, they don't. Furthermore, many of the changes that Judaism went through by the way of Christianity move it further from pagan doctrines. Animal sacrifice was no longer needed, something still happening among the pagans. Abstaining from certain foods was rejected, something that would have been only reinforced had Jesus come from the myths of Attis and other myths, since they abstained from eating pig because Attis was killed by a boar. Similarly, dietary restrictions were common among pagan religions, but Christianity moved away from it rather than toward it. Jesus mythicists give no explanation for why suddenly Jewish culture, which had been so adamantly resistant to giving in to the culture around them, suddenly caved. The idea that Jews were wanting to gain popularity is unfounded, and frankly shows a lack of knowledge of Jewish history, both before and after the time of Christ. Jews were never focused on proselytizing, though they were never afraid to share their faith and stand by it. They were not focused on bringing more and more people to Judaism. In fact, the Jews of the time of Christ were aloof to the Samaritans and Gentiles, in a way of trying to distance themselves rather than to get close to or assimilate with them. As we dive into seeing if any of these pagan narratives parallel Jesus' resurrection story, we need to have a clear grasp on what characteristics would make a parallel. The most common characteristic Jesus mythicists bring up seem to be the crucifixion as a mode of killing and being dead for 3 days. A few other characteristics are worthy of mention that mythicists typically don't bring up. Jesus died for a purpose, the greatest purpose of all. In fact, that's why Christianity falls upon whether Jesus died on the cross or not, bringing salvation to all of mankind through what he did. If Jesus is a parallel, we should expect that the pagan myths that Jesus is based upon to have had a deity dying for some good, and at the very least, some portion of mankind. Jesus was wrongly accused when he was brought to trial, so we should expect in some way that the parallels of Jesus should include some sort of trial in which the deity is condemned to death for unjust reasons. This is not to say that in order for a pagan myth to parallel Jesus, they must share all of these characteristics, but it is hard to say that it is a parallel if it does not share a fair amount of them. Musicians Patsy Cline, Buddy Hall, John Denver, Stevie Ray Vaughan, and Leonard Skinner all died in plane crashes. That is not enough to say that their lives parallel each other. Death has always been a dreaded and feared part of mankind, and so it is very natural that a myth should have a resurrection story. A deity that simply resurrection does not share enough commonality with Jesus to be a story which Jesus is supposed to be based upon. So, as we evaluate these myths, we will be specifically looking at 5 characteristics. Did they resurrect? Did they die by crucifixion? Were they dead for 3 days? Did they die for a purpose or cause? And was an unjust trial connected to their death? Osiris and Horus are both Egyptian gods that different Jesus mythicists believe have resurrected from the dead or even were crucified. The first problem with this is that Egyptians did not believe in resurrection in the same way that Jesus is believed to have risen from the dead. While Christians talk of Jesus rising from the dead in the same physical body that he was crucified in and living on the same earth, clearly seen in how he shows his hands and feet to Thomas. The ancient Egyptians believed that in life after death in a realm of the dead with new or no bodies at all, Horus becomes alive again after death and rules over the dead. But there is no longer in the same place as before, and by some narratives has no body at all. In that sense, then Horus did not rise from the dead, but is experiencing or even ruling in an after-death life, not a resurrected life as it is with Jesus. As for the specific stories of Osiris and Horus rising from the dead, there seems to be little evidence to back up this claim. Horus, for instance, is claimed to have been crucified according to Zeitgeist, but even Fraser says that Horus was killed by a scorpion and his resurrection was brought about by his mother Isis pulling the venom from him through the utterance of a spell. As far as our other characteristics, there is no indication that Horus, being dead for 3 days, dying for a cause or an unjust trial. With Osiris, we have a similar problem, in that again the narrative has no real familiarities with Jesus' death and resurrection. Osiris was murdered by another god, Set. Though the reasons vary, this already puts Horus on a different category of death than Jesus, since Osiris' death has no foreseen purpose to mankind. Furthermore, according to Fraser and other sources, after Osiris dies, he is chopped up into multiple pieces while in a coffin, and then brought back together by Isis, Horus, and Anubis, but only in the sense that he rules over the dead in the land of the dead. So though one might argue Horus has the same body when he died, he does not live on earth again, unlike Jesus. So though one might argue that Horus has the same body when he was resurrected, he does not live on earth again, unlike Jesus' resurrection. Again, there is no information to declare that Horus was resurrected in 3 days, no purpose for his death, and no trial. Finally, it should be noted that Horus is believed to be the manifestation of Osiris, which though one might try to construe that as a parallel to the Trinity, it would be clear misunderstanding of what the Christians understand as the Trinity. This would fall under the heresy of modalism, which was condemned by the Church in 381 in the Conference of Constantinople. Overall, we can probably give Horus 1 out of 5 and Osiris half of out of 5. I mean, like 0.5 out of 5, making neither a parallel of Jesus, since the only thing they somewhat seem to share is a resurrection story. Attis, according to Jesus' mythicists, was crucified, was dead for 3 days, then rose from the dead just like Jesus. Unfortunately, for Jesus' mythicists, this depiction does not fit what we know from the sources we have about him. Fraser's own recording of his death and resurrection is clear stretch from the parallels of Jesus' Attis story. Fraser writes, "The story of his death by the boar may have been told to explain why his worshippers, especially the people of Pessimus, abstained from eating swine. In like manner, the worshippers of Adonis abstained from pork because a boar had killed their god. After his death, Attis is said to have been changed into a pine tree. So Attis is not crucified, but killed by a boar. He was not resurrected, but instead turned into a tree. It's hard to see any parallels to Jesus in this narrative, and to call Attis resurrected isn't simply a play on words, but a flat-out lie. There is no mention of an unjust trial, no purpose to Attis' death, and no mention of being dead for 3 days. So for Attis, we can give him a resounding 0 out of 5. Krishna, according to Jesus' mythicists, also rose from the dead and therefore parallels Jesus' resurrection. Like Osiris, Horus, and Attis, Krishna's death is not sacrificial like that of Christ's. And so his supposed resurrection already knocks hollow for a parallel of Jesus. The story, like any other pagan myth, has multiple versions. In one interpretation, Krishna is killed as the result of a quarrel with Gandhari, who curses him. Later, Krishna is killed by a hunter, Jara, who mistakes him for a sleeping deer. It is probably assumed that the accidental death of Krishna was the result of the curse. Another version of the story says that Krishna is killed in some battle or other known danger he chose not to escape. The narrative explains that Krishna did not bring safety to any of the women and children involved in the story, but he could have escaped death himself. But he went, rather without reason, to accept his own death. That being known, Krishna's death does not really serve a purpose like Jesus. From my research, I found that the story of Krishna being shot by a hunter seems more widely accepted. Still, upon trying to find an actual ancient source referencing his death, supposedly the Mahabharata, it's a hard word to say, I found no reference to Krishna's death. That being said, it seems Krishna does not die, and even if he did, his death is nothing purposeful like that of Christ. Furthermore, Krishna's resurrection is actually him being reborn. Krishna is literally born a second time as a baby, but this time as God rather than a man. So not only is he not in the same body, he is a child, making this a reincarnation rather than a resurrection. Other traditions give no real indication of Krishna dying at all, but put him being death itself. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, I am immortality. I am also death personified, and I am all devouring death, and I am the generating principle of all that is to be. So Krishna does not die, but is death itself. With all this information, we see that Krishna was not crucified, no indication that he was dead for 3 days, no unjust trial, no purpose for his death, and even in the closest versions of his story, no real resurrection. Krishna then shares no real parallels with Jesus, giving him a solid 0 out of 5. Dionysus. According to the Jesus mythicists, Dionysus is one of the clearest parallels to Jesus. Mythicists will note that Dionysus is the sun god Zeus. Followers drink wine and bread to remember him. He was crucified, was dead for 3 days, was put on trial, and rose from the dead. At first blush, of course, this seems like a parallel story of Christ. For the sake of this video, we'll only be focusing on those parallels that talk about the resurrection. Dionysus' death, as recorded in almost every narrative, is the result of the Titans ripping him to pieces. Fraser records the narrative. Scarcely was he born when the babe mounted the throne of his father Zeus and mimicked the great god by brandishing the lightning in his tiny hand. But he did not occupy the throne for long. For the treacherous Titans, their faces whitened with chalk, attacked him with knives while he was looking at himself in a mirror. For a time, he evaded their assaults by turning himself into various shapes, assuming the likeness of successors of Zeus and Kronos, of a young man, of a lion, a horse, and of a serpent. Finally, in the form of bull, he was cut into pieces by the murderous knives of his enemies. So Dionysus was not crucified, but was stabbed to death. Dionysus' resurrection, under several narratives, fits more of a rebirth than a resurrection. Fraser records 2 narratives where Dionysus' heart is either eaten by Zeus or Semele, and then Dionysus is reborn. Fraser also claims in some narratives it is simply said that shortly after his burial, he rose from the dead and ascended up into heaven. But there seems to be no evidence of the narrative he's speaking of here. It would be a good parallel, but there is no evidence of it. The assertion that Dionysus went to trial comes from Bacchae, which depicts Dionysus going back to get revenge on a city that ruined his mother's name, which mocked her for saying Dionysus was the son of Zeus. Dionysus goes to trial for some of the trouble he makes for the city by making women go crazy over him. He does not meekly go like Christ, but has victory over his captors, to whom he went willingly at first. Dionysus is not crucified, and there's no indication that his captors even intended such an end for him. So the trial in the end has no connection with Dionysus' death, so not really fitting the trial characteristic we are looking for. As for the claim that Dionysus was crucified, it appears to come from 2 lines of reasoning. One is that Dionysus was believed to be the god of the tree, or other similar names indicating he was the god of the trees. There's no indication that he was in any way hung on a tree like Jesus. The other argument comes from Orpheus' amulet. It depicts Dionysus being crucified. The depiction has been soundly proven false, most obviously seen in the relaxed posture of the victim on the cross, which is later style of depicting crucifixion. Even Jesus mythicists, Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy, admit the amulet does nothing to prove their theory despite using the amulet in the front cover of their book, The Jesus Mysteries. Was the original Jesus a pagan god? In the end, even Dionysus seems to ring flat of a parallel of Jesus. Under any documented sources, he is reborn rather than resurrection. He has no unjust trial resulting in his death. He is not crucified. He is not dead for 3 days, and he dies not for a purpose, but for the result of his stepmom's and goddess Heres's jealousy. Dionysus falls short of fitting even one of the characteristics we're looking for. According to Jesus mythicists, the Babylonian god Mithras was dead for 3 days and then resurrected, and some, like Fraser, even try to make the claim that Mithras' death and resurrection happened on the same day of the year as Jesus. The problem with this theory is there is absolutely no evidence that Mithras ever died. The best source that can be found claiming any sort of a resurrection comes from Kiersey Graves, the 16 crucifixions. The best source that can be found claiming that any sort of resurrection comes from Kiersey Graves, the 16 Saviors, which has been viewed as wholly unreliable and not well researched. Richard Carrier, a Jesus mythicist himself, even finds the book unreliable, saying the world's 16 crucified saviors, or Christianity before Christ, is unreliable. No comprehensive critique exists. Most scholars immediately recognize many of his findings as unsupported and dismiss Graves as useless. That being said, Mithra is not crucified, did not have an unjust trial, did not die for a purpose, was not dead for 3 days, and was clearly not resurrected. Mithras gets then a clear 0 out of 5. After examining a few of the best examples Jesus mythicists can give to claim that Jesus is a copy of pagan deities before him, we see that they have absolutely no grounding to stand on. Even the best examples like Horus and certain version of Krishna only really share one characteristic with Jesus' resurrection. To drive the point home a bit more, I think a few more things that we should point out of some of the flaws to Jesus mythicists. Another indication that Jesus mythicists are not presenting a strong case is how ridiculous some of the parallels are. Freck and Gandhi conclude their chapter of parallels between Osiris and Dionysus with some very surface level parallels. Jesus is portrayed as a quiet man with long hair and a beard. So is Osiris and Dionysus. Beards were the norm in that age. So that he had a beard would be almost like saying two men must be the same in this age because they both have a car. Freck and Gandhi calling Jesus quiet, we must ask if they're familiar with Jesus tossing the tables on multiple occasions. Doesn't quite fit that story of Jesus being quiet. Jesus is born in Bethlehem is another thing that they would point out, which was shaded by a grove sacred to Osiris and Dionysus. This isn't a parallel at all, but would only show that they existed in the same area. They also bring up that Jesus is betrayed for 30 pieces of silver, a motive found in the story of Socrates, even though we know Socrates is a historical person. Now they are not creating parallels to God, which is a grounding of the whole Jesus mythicist theory. Furthermore, Socrates was not betrayed for any sum of money, but there is mention of 30 minau, not silver, of a bribe to set him free. So the money for Socrates is to save him, and the money for Jesus condemns him, making it no parallel at all. Another problem is that the idea of crucifixion is believed to have been invented by the Persians. Without understanding, the idea of Krishna, Horus, or Osiris are crucified is automatically ruled out since their civilizations predate the Persian Empire. Finally, putting a final nail in the coffin, Jesus mythicists have given no explanation for the eyewitness accounts of Jesus' death and resurrection. Even by some of the most liberal, skeptical scholars, it is well accepted that the writers of the New Testament were eyewitnesses or new eyewitnesses to the events that they are recording. Jesus mythicists have to give an explanation for the eyewitness records of Jesus' death and resurrection, and they have simply avoided the subject altogether. In summation, we have found that Jesus mythicist theory that Jesus did not actually rise from the dead because he was based upon pagan myths falls short on almost every count we can think of. Parallels of Jesus' story from older mythologies would not disprove Jesus did rise from the dead, even if they do exist. We have no reason to think that Jews would suddenly assimilate with other religions or modify their religion to gain followers. No mythology's resurrections actually parallel the resurrection of Jesus in any significant extent. Jesus mythicists have grasped at straws to find parallels and been found wanting. Finally, they have simply ignored the clear evidence which points to Jesus rising from the dead. And in the end, there is no reason to believe that Jesus' resurrection was made up based on pagan mythologies. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the content, please like and subscribe and tell some other people about it. If this has been helpful for you, please also think about supporting this financially, and that will allow me to produce more content. There's a link below. Thanks a lot.